The ink wasn't even dry on the paper when her uncle ripped the restaurant keys from her hand. "This place belongs to me now," Raymond Mercer said, not even looking at her. "Your father should have thought about that before he died owing me money." Lydia stood in the middle of the kitchen her mother had built from nothing, the same kitchen where she'd learned to salt a pot, to taste with her eyes closed, to love someone through what she put on their plate. And she watched a stranger change the locks on the front door. She was 29 years old. She had $41. And a cookbook. If that were you, standing in your own home while someone legal papered it out from under you, what would you do? Before we go further, if stories like this reach something in your chest, please subscribe to this channel and follow Lydia's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Texas, 1889, and to a woman who had nothing left but a worn leather book and the one thing nobody could take from her. The morning Raymond Mercer changed the locks, Lydia didn't cry. That surprised her. Later, she'd expected to fall apart right there on the sidewalk in front of Mercer's home kitchen. The sign her father had painted himself. The letters slightly uneven because he'd insisted on doing it freehand, even though her mother begged him to use a stencil. She'd expected her legs to give out, or her voice to break, or something physical and dramatic to happen to mark the moment her entire life dissolved. Instead, she stood on the hard-packed dirt of Caldwell Street and watched Raymond hand the new key to his son, a smirking 22-year-old who had never cooked a single meal in his life, and she felt something cold and very still settle into her chest. Not grief yet, something colder than grief. The restaurant had been in her mother's family for 11 years. Her mother, Clara, had started it with a borrowed iron skillet and a table she'd dragged from the alley behind a boarding house. Her father, George Mercer, had spent 14-hour days building the place from a greasy counter into a dining room that seated 40 people. Lydia had grown up in that kitchen. She'd done her arithmetic homework on a flour-dusted prep table. She'd fallen asleep more than once in the corner chair near the bread oven, covered with her mother's apron, while her parents worked late into the night. When her parents died, her mother from pneumonia 3 winters back, her father 18 months after, from what the doctor said was a failing heart, but what Lydia privately believed was grief. The restaurant should have passed to her. George had always said so, told her 100 times. "This place is yours, Liddy. You've earned every inch of it." What George had never done was put that promise in writing. Raymond Mercer, George's younger brother, had noticed that gap. Raymond had been circling the restaurant like a patient animal for years, mentioning at family dinners that George had borrowed money from him back in the early days, dropping the figure casually at first, and then less casually as time went on. After George died, Raymond produced a handwritten loan document, something George had apparently signed, that Raymond claimed gave him ownership rights if the debt went unpaid. Lydia had never seen that document before in her life. She'd hired a lawyer with the last of her savings. The lawyer had looked at the document, looked at Raymond's other paperwork, and told her quietly that challenging it would cost more than the restaurant was worth and take years she didn't have. So that was that. Raymond got the building, the equipment, the name above the door, the goodwill, the regular customers, and 41 years of her family's work. Lydia got a cardboard box with her mother's cookbook in it, a carpet bag with 2 dresses and a change of boots, and $41 she'd been keeping in a coffee tin beneath the prep table. She spent 3 days sleeping on the floor of a friend's house, too stunned to plan anything. On the 4th day, her friend's husband made it politely clear that the arrangement couldn't continue. Lydia understood. She didn't blame them. She packed her bag, tucked her mother's cookbook under her arm, and walked to the stage depot. She wasn't sure where she was going. She just knew she had to go somewhere that wasn't here, somewhere Raymond Mercer's face wasn't part of the landscape, somewhere she might be able to breathe without tasting bitterness every time she opened her mouth. She bought a ticket to the farthest point her money could reach without leaving her completely broke. That turned out to be a place called Decker's Crossing, a dusty transit stop 300 miles west, at the edge of the Texas Hill Country, where the land flattened out and the sky got so big it was almost frightening. The stage ride took 2 days and smelled like horse sweat and pipe tobacco. Lydia sat with her bag in her lap and her mother's cookbook held against her chest like a child holds something they're afraid might vanish. She didn't speak to the other passengers. She looked out the window at the land going past and tried to figure out what a person was supposed to do when the thing they'd built their whole identity around had been taken from them before they were 30. She didn't come up with any good answers. Decker's Crossing was not a destination. It was a junction, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, with a general store, a depot office, a bar room, and a handful of houses arranged without any apparent plan around a packed dirt square. Lydia stepped off the stage into the late afternoon heat and immediately understood that she could not stay here. There was nothing here to stay for. She spent that night in the corner of the depot waiting room on a wooden bench, using her carpetbag as a pillow. The depot agent, a heavy-set man with a ginger mustache, glanced at her twice and then left her alone. She was grateful for that. In the morning, she asked him if there was any work in the area. "Cooking," she said. She was a cook. He scratched the back of his neck. "There's ranches out that way," he said, nodding west. "Some of them hire on women for kitchen work. Can't say who's hiring right now." He thought for a moment. Stone Ridge might be. They lost their cook a few weeks back under strange circumstances. But I'll tell you plain, the man who runs that place isn't easy. "Easy isn't what I need," Lydia said. She asked directions to Stone Ridge Ranch and started walking. It was 9 miles. She walked all of it in the rising morning heat, her carpetbag in one hand, her mother's cookbook under her other arm, her boots raising small puffs of dust with every step. Twice she passed through gates she had to open and close herself. Once she startled a jackrabbit that shot across the trail so fast she gasped before she could stop herself. A hawk circled overhead for the last 2 miles, which she tried not to interpret as anything. She wasn't a woman who believed in signs. Signs were for people who had the luxury of waiting. Stone Ridge Ranch announced itself slowly. First the fence line, then the distant shapes of cattle, then a cluster of outbuildings, and finally the main house and the long, low structure beside it that turned out to be the bunkhouse. The yard between them was beaten smooth by years of boots, and there were several cowboys moving around the perimeter with the particular kind of tired efficiency that told Lydia they'd been doing the same things too many hours in a row. A man came out of the main house as she reached the yard. He wasn't what she'd expected, though she hadn't been sure what she'd expected. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, lean in the way that comes from real work rather than deprivation, with weathered skin and dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore a clean shirt and dusty trousers, and a look that said he had no patience for people who wasted his time. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes went to the carpetbag, then to the cookbook under her arm, then to her face. "You're lost," he said, not unkindly, but as a statement of fact. "I'm not," she said. "I'm looking for the owner of Stone Ridge Ranch." "You found him." He didn't offer his name, didn't come any closer. "Silas Boone." "Lydia Mercer." She shifted the cookbook to her other arm. "I heard your cook left. I'd like to apply for the position." Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated than surprise. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he genuinely can't categorize, and Lydia had the distinct impression this was not a common experience for him. "Where'd you cook before?" he asked. "My family's restaurant in Caldwell, Mercer's Home Kitchen. We operated for 11 years. Had a restaurant, and now you're walking 9 miles in the heat for a ranch cook job." His voice wasn't mocking. He was just noting the math, making sure it added up to something he recognized. "What happened to the restaurant?" "It was taken from me," she said, "legally, by a relative." She said it straight, no elaboration, because she'd found in the past several days that elaboration led to pity, and pity led to people treating her like she was broken. And she wasn't broken. She was furious, and there was a difference. Silas Boone looked at her for a long moment. "I've got 32 men to feed," he said. 3 meals a day. Kitchen's behind the main house. It's not a small job." "I know what a large kitchen is," Lydia said. "My last cook—" He stopped. Something shuddered across his face. "My last cook left without notice. Kitchen's been unmanaged for 3 weeks. It's not in good order." "I don't require good order to start," she said. "I require a chance." He studied her again. She got the feeling he was looking for some indication of what she was going to cost him. Not in money, but in trouble, in disruption, in things that were harder to calculate. "Dinner's at 6, he said finally. "You've got from now until then." She'd been hired. She understood this, even though he hadn't said the word hired. She nodded and asked him to show her the kitchen. It was worse than he'd described. Not filthy. Someone had kept it from going completely to ruin, but deeply disorganized, with stores she had to inventory from scratch, and equipment that hadn't been properly maintained in longer than 3 weeks. The range needed work. The flour bin was nearly empty. There was a root cellar that turned out to be better stocked than she'd feared, and a smokehouse out back with enough preserved meat to work with. She had 4 hours. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury, and she was fresh out of those. She tied her hair back, hung her jacket on the peg by the door, put her mother's cookbook on the top shelf where it could watch over everything without being in the way, and started taking stock. The men began drifting toward the dining hall at 5:30. She could hear them outside, the low murmur of voices, the thud of boots on packed earth. There were more than she'd expected, not just the 32 hands, but 3 or 4 extra men she didn't recognize. She didn't have time to investigate. She cooked what the kitchen had, nothing more. Beef braised low and slow in the oven for most of the afternoon. Cornbread with a crust that cracked when you broke it. Beans from the cellar, cooked down until they were dense and smoky. Apple butter from a jar she found in the back of a cabinet, still sealed, probably older than her employment here. She set the tables herself. There was no one else to do it. And she made them look like tables where a meal was going to happen, rather than tables where fuel was going to be distributed. She'd learned that from her mother. The difference between those two things was invisible to most people and absolutely everything to the ones eating. At 6 o'clock, she opened the dining hall door. The men came in the way working men always come in, noisily, in clusters, trading comments she wasn't meant to hear. They settled into their places with the automatic efficiency of men who'd eaten in the same building for years and had assigned themselves spots without being told. Lydia served. She was quiet about it. She didn't explain the food or apologize for the kitchen's limitations or fill the air with reassurance. She moved around the room with the plates and she watched, the way she'd always watched. The small things that other people missed. The way a man's shoulders came down a fraction when a plate was set in front of him. The slight opening of expression on a face that had been closed all day. The dining hall was never completely quiet. These were working men with things to say to each other, stories from the day, complaints to air. But there was a particular kind of quiet that settled over the room about 5 minutes into the meal, and Lydia recognized it because she'd produced it before. It was the quiet of people eating something that made them, momentarily, not think about anything else. She was refilling a water pitcher at the back of the room when she heard the voice. Silas Boone was sitting at the far end of the head table, his fork halfway to his mouth, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read from that distance. He said something to the man beside him, too low to carry across the room. Then he set his fork down, which she noticed because he hadn't finished what was on his plate. He pushed back from the table and crossed the room toward her with a walk that was unhurried and completely direct, and she held the water pitcher and waited because there was nothing else to do. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see his face clearly now, and what was on it wasn't satisfaction or approval or any of the things she'd been hoping for. It was something more unsettled than that, something that looked, oddly, like a man who'd been caught off guard by something he thought he was immune to. He looked at her for a moment, then he said very quietly, "Who are you?" Not where are you from, not what did you put in this, not even a compliment about the meal, just that. Who are you? Lydia held the water pitcher and looked at him and thought about all the true answers to that question. The restaurant, her parents, her mother's kitchen, Raymond's face when he changed the lock, 9 miles on a dusty trail with $41 and a cookbook. "I'm your cook," she said. Silas looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and went back to his seat. But he picked up his fork again, and he finished what was on his plate. Lydia turned back to the water pitcher and permitted herself in private the smallest possible smile. It wasn't a victory. It was a foothold. There was a large difference. But foothold was enough to start with. She'd learned that too, a long time ago. In a kitchen that no longer belonged to her, from a woman whose handwriting still lived in a leather book on the highest shelf. The shelf Lydia had chosen specifically because her mother had always said, "Put the things that matter somewhere you have to reach for them. That way you never forget they cost you something." Outside, the Texas evening was cooling fast, the way it did in the hill country when the sun dropped. 1 minute burning, the next almost cold, no gentle middle. The men were still eating. The room was full of low talk and the sound of metal on tin. Someone laughed at something, a real laugh, the kind that happens without planning. Lydia refilled 3 more water pitchers, wiped down the sideboard, and started calculating what she'd need to order before the week was out. She had 32 men to feed. She was going to need more flour. The morning after the first dinner, Lydia woke before 4. She lay still for a moment in the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen that Silas had pointed her toward the previous night without ceremony. Just rooms through that door, and then he'd walked away. And she listened to the ranch settle into its early sounds. A horse shifting in the corral, wind moving through the gap under the door. Somewhere distant, a coyote finishing its conversation with the dark. She'd slept 4 hours. It was enough. It had to be. She got up, laced her boots, and went into the kitchen. The range took 20 minutes to coax back to proper heat. Because the flue had a partial blockage she hadn't had time to address the day before. She made a mental note to deal with it before lunch. She started coffee first because coffee was what stood between 32 working men and 32 very irritable ones, and then she began on breakfast. She didn't have a set menu. That was one of the first things she'd need to establish. A weekly rotation that accounted for what the ranch had in stores, what could be ordered and when delivery came, what preserved well and what didn't. But that was a week away from being organized. Today she worked with what she had. Eggs, because there were chickens, and the coop was behind the smokehouse. Salt pork from the smokehouse itself. Grits from the bin she'd found in the back pantry, nearly full. She made a large pot of red-eye gravy because the drippings were there and because it was the kind of thing that made a man feel like the morning was going to go better than expected. The first hand came in at 5:15. He was young. Younger than she'd clocked at dinner, maybe 19, with a face that was still deciding what it was going to look like, and dark circles under his eyes that told her he hadn't slept much either. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her already at the range. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said, without turning around. He came in and sat at the end of the long table nearest the kitchen door. Lydia set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He wrapped both hands around it and stared into it the way young men stare at things when they're trying to hold themselves together. She didn't ask what was wrong. She went back to the grits. After a few minutes, he said, "I didn't think you'd still be here." "Why not?" He shrugged, a gesture she could hear rather than see. "Nobody stays at Stone Ridge very long anymore, not since—" He stopped. She waited. "Not since Mrs. Boone died," he said. "Things got kind of quiet around here, not the right kind of quiet." Lydia turned the heat down under the grits and gave them a slow stir. "How long ago was that?" 4 years, give or take." She nodded but didn't ask more. She could tell there was more. There was always more when people stopped themselves mid-sentence. But she'd learned in 11 years of running a restaurant that the way to get someone to keep talking was to stop pulling on the thread. Let them find their own way back to it. His name was Noah Reyes. She found this out when 3 more men came in at 5:30, and one of them said, "Reyes, you're supposed to be at the north fence at 6, not sitting in here with your boots off." And Noah said, "My boots are on, Torres, and I've got 20 minutes. And Torres said something indelicate in Spanish that made the other 2 men laugh, and Noah grinned despite himself. Torres was a man somewhere in his 40s with a thick mustache and the bearing of someone who'd been competent at things for so long that he'd lost the ability to be impressed. He sat down at the table, looked at the cup of coffee Lydia set in front of him, picked it up, and drank from it without a word. Then he looked at her. "Good coffee," he said. This appeared to be the full extent of what he planned to offer. "Thank you," Lydia said. "Our last cook made it like river water," Torres said. "Every morning, like he was doing it on purpose." "Maybe he was," said one of the other men, and Torres grunted. By 6 o'clock, the dining hall was full, and Lydia had breakfast on the table. And what she noticed, what she always noticed, because she couldn't help it, it was how her mind worked, was the architecture of the room. Not the physical structure, but the human one. Who sat next to whom, and who sat pointedly away from whom. Who talked, and who ate in silence, and whether the silence was comfortable or the other kind. Who looked tired, and who looked like something heavier than tired. There were 2 men at the far end of the second table who didn't speak to each other or to anyone nearby them. They were roughly the same age, late 30s, and they ate with the rigid carefulness of people maintaining a large distance in a small space. She filed that away. There was an older man, maybe 60, who ate slower than the rest and held his right hand slightly differently than his left, and who accepted the plate she set before him with a nod that was more formal and deliberate than courtesy required. The nod of a man for whom small dignities mattered because larger ones had not always been available to him. And there was Silas Boone at the head of the far table, eating without appearing to eat, because most of his attention was somewhere else, going over something in his head, running numbers or running problems, the focused inward look of a man carrying more than the visible weight of the job. He didn't speak to her at breakfast. She hadn't expected him to. What she hadn't expected was the moment near the end of the meal when the older man with the careful hand, she learned later his name was Pete Darrow, and he'd been on the ranch for 12 years, pushed back his plate with a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh, and wasn't quite satisfaction, but lived in the neighborhood of both, and said to no one in particular, "That's the first hot breakfast that tasted like something since June." Nobody responded directly, but several men looked up from their plates for a moment, and one of them caught Lydia's eye across the room, and she saw in his face the particular expression of a person who has been reminded of something good that they'd nearly stopped expecting. She went back to the kitchen and started on the lunch prep. The rhythm of the first week was brutal, not because Silas made it brutal. He left her largely alone, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted, but because a kitchen that has been unmanaged for 3 weeks is not simply untidy. It has developed gaps, like a body that hasn't been fed properly, develops gaps in places you don't immediately see. She found them one by one. The inconsistent supply schedule, the smokehouse inventory that hadn't been cross-referenced with the main pantry in months, the root cellar that had a slow moisture problem nobody had addressed. She wrote lists. She crossed things off lists and wrote new ones. She established a weekly ordering system by talking her way through the general store in Decker's Crossing when Torres made the supply run on Thursday, standing at the counter and explaining to the store owner, a thin-faced man named Greer, what she needed and when she needed it, and that she expected consistency. Greer looked at her like she was slightly unusual. "Mr. Boone's never sent a woman to do ordering before," he said. "Mr. Boone sent Torres," she said pleasantly. "I came along to make sure it was done correctly." Torres, who was loading sacks of flour into the wagon behind her, made a sound that might have been a cough. Greer processed her order. On the ride back, Torres said, without preamble, "You're going to step on some toes around here." "I stepped carefully," Lydia said. "Didn't look that careful back there." "There's a difference between careful and invisible," she said. "I'm not trying to be invisible." Torres was quiet for a while. The wagon wheels turned over the dry road, and the afternoon heat pushed down on everything. Then he said, "The last cook, his name was Hector Vine. He left in the middle of the night 3 weeks ago. Didn't tell anyone, didn't leave a note. Just gone." "The owner at the depot mentioned something like that," Lydia said carefully. "What he probably didn't mention is that Hector wasn't the type to leave without a reason. He'd been here 6 years, knew everyone's name, knew everyone's coffee. Men like that don't just disappear." Torres kept his eyes on the road. "I'm telling you this because you seem like the kind of person who notices things. And I think there are things around here worth noticing." Lydia looked at the road ahead and kept her voice even. "What kind of things?" Torres said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You cook. That's your job. It's a good job and you do it well. I'm just saying." He clicked his tongue at the horses. "Things worth noticing." She didn't push him further, but she turned what he'd said over in her mind for the rest of the ride back and again that evening while she was putting up the dinner dishes, listening to the sounds of the bunkhouse carry across the yard through the open kitchen window. Something had happened here before she arrived. She could feel it the way you feel a healed-over place in wood, smooth on the surface, wrong underneath. By the end of the second week, the dining hall had changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of change you could point to and explain to someone who hadn't been there before. But Lydia felt it, and she thought the men felt it, even if they wouldn't have used the word for what it was. The word was warmth, not the warmth of the range, though there was that too. The kitchen ran hot, and the dining hall picked it up through the shared wall. This was the other kind, the kind that comes from a place where meals happen that are worth sitting down for, where someone has thought about what goes on the plate rather than just what fills it. She'd started small things. Cornbread on Tuesdays because she'd noticed Torres tore into it with more appetite than anything else on the table. A pot of cinnamon apple preserves on the breakfast table every morning because she'd seen old Pete Darrow looking for something sweet after his eggs and trying not to make it obvious. For the 2 men at the far end of the second table who never spoke to each other, she'd started seating the meals so they were served from opposite sides of the room at the same time. A small logistical thing that meant they never had reason to interact, but also never had reason to feel the awkwardness of deliberately being in the same space. She'd asked Noah Reyes on the 4th day why those 2 men didn't speak. Noah had been in this kitchen helping her move a sack of beans. She'd asked him to help, and he'd agreed with the eagerness of someone who'd been looking for somewhere to be. And he'd gotten a complicated look on his face. Burke and Sellers, he said. They had a falling out about 8 months ago, over something nobody will talk about directly. Some of the other men say it was about money, but I don't know. I just know they used to be like brothers, and now they can't be in a room together without the air going bad. Has Mr. Boone said anything about it? Mr. Boone doesn't really say much about anything that isn't directly related to the cattle or the land. Noah set down his end of the sack. He's not a bad man. I want to be fair. He's just been somewhere else in his head for a long time. Since his wife died, Lydia said. Noah looked at her. You know about that? You mentioned it the first morning, she said. You said things got quiet after that, the wrong kind of quiet. He nodded slowly. Her name was Margaret. She was… He paused, searching for the word, and what came out was honest in the unglamorous way of someone who isn't trying to be poetic. She was the reason the place felt like a place, you know? Like she was the thing that made it somewhere people wanted to be rather than just somewhere they slept between work. When she died, Mr. Boone kept the ranch running. He kept everything going. He just kind of stopped. Noah shrugged. Being here, I mean, he's here, but he's not. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Help me with the other sack. Noah helped her with the other sack. It was during the 3rd week that she first overheard the conversation about the land. She hadn't been eavesdropping. She needed to make it clear to herself afterward that she had not been eavesdropping because it mattered to her that she wasn't that kind of person. She was in the narrow passage between the kitchen and the back of the main house retrieving a pot she'd left on the outdoor washing bench, and the window above her, Silas's office window, she realized, was open because the evening was still warm, and the voices came through it clearly before she understood what she was hearing. Silas's voice she recognized immediately. The other voice was older, rougher, someone she didn't know. Can't keep ignoring it, Silas. Harlow's got a lawyer now, a real one, not his nephew. I know. Silas's voice was flat. Not the flatness of someone who didn't care, she was learning to read the difference, but the flatness of someone compressing something very large into a very small space. The eastern pasture is 40 acres of your best grazing land. You lose that and you lose… I know what I lose, Frank. A pause. Lydia stood very still with the pot in her hands. His claim is that the original deed had an error in the survey, Frank said. That the boundary line was drawn wrong back in '74 and the eastern 40 was always part of Harlow's property. The survey was done by Elias Corbin, Silas said. Corbin did every property in this county for 30 years. He didn't make errors. He's dead, Frank said bluntly, and Harlow's lawyer has paperwork. Another silence, longer this time. What kind of paperwork? Silas asked. That's what I don't know. County records, supposedly. Something filed during the land transfer period in '78. I haven't been able to get my hands on a copy yet, but the lawyer's talking about it like it's solid. And if it's solid… It's not solid, Frank said sharply. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Something about this doesn't sit right. The timing, the way Harlow's been at it lately, the fact that his lawyer started making noise right around when you missed last quarter's payment to the bank. It smells like something that was waiting for the right moment. His voice dropped. I think someone helped that moment along. Lydia heard Silas move, a chair scraping, footsteps. I'll deal with it, he said. You've been saying that for… I said, I'll deal with it, Frank. The conversation ended there. Lydia walked back to the kitchen quietly, set the pot down on the range, and stood with her hands flat on the work table for a moment, staring at the surface of it. A land dispute, fraudulent paperwork, possibly. A neighboring rancher named Harlow, who'd been watching for weakness and found it. And a man who was trying to hold everything together by himself because that was the only way he'd known how to operate for 4 years. She should stay out of it. She said this to herself clearly and firmly, the same way she said it to herself every time in her life she'd noticed something that wasn't her business, the same way she'd never quite managed to actually follow that advice. The following Sunday, Silas came into the kitchen. He came in the way he always appeared in spaces, directly, without preamble, as if arriving were simply the next logical step from wherever he'd been. He stopped inside the door and looked at her. She was working on the week's bread, her hands in the dough, and she looked back at him without stopping what she was doing. The men are saying things, he said. What kind of things? Good things. He said it like the words were slightly foreign to him, like he was translating something. About the food, about the feeling of the place. The dining hall, she said. The dining hall, he agreed. He didn't seem to know what to do with this information, which was interesting. She kept her hands in the dough. Burke and Sellers ate at the same table this morning, he said. She hadn't engineered that. She'd arranged the seating to give them space, and apparently they'd found their own way to the same table eventually. She didn't say this. I know, she said. They looked uncomfortable, but they both finished their plates. Something shifted at the corner of Silas's mouth. Not quite a smile. Not yet. But the tectonic possibility of one. You notice a lot, he said. It helps to cook for someone if you know something about them. I was quiet for a moment. She could hear the bread moving under her hands, the soft resistance of the dough. Then he said, My wife was like that. She didn't speak. Margaret, he said. She could walk into a room and know within 10 minutes what everyone in it needed and who was unhappy and what might fix it. He stopped. Started again more carefully. Not in an interfering way, she just knew people. That's a hard thing to lose, Lydia said. Yes. The word was short and absolute. They stayed in that quiet for a moment. Then Silas said, I need to talk to you about your compensation. We haven't settled on a number. They settled on a number. It was fair. More than fair, actually, she thought, though she'd been too desperate at the start to have demanded anything. She accepted it without bargaining because she was not in a position to bargain, and they both knew it, and she appreciated that he didn't make her pretend otherwise. When he turned to go, she said, without planning to, Mr. Boone. He stopped. She hesitated only a moment. She'd been turning over what she'd heard through the office window for 6 days, and she knew she was about to do something she had no business doing. She did it anyway. I don't know the details of your situation with the Harlow property dispute, she said, keeping her voice level. I'm not asking you to tell me, but if the claim involves documents that were filed during a transfer period, there's usually a registration log, a physical one, kept at the county seat. And those logs show when documents were added and by whose hand. They're not always checked against the documents themselves. Silas was very still. I'm not an attorney, she said, and I might be entirely wrong. I'm just saying that in my father's case, with the restaurant, the one thing nobody thought to look at was the original registration sequence. My lawyer told me afterward it might have mattered if we'd caught it sooner. A long silence. How do you know about registration logs? He asked. My father taught himself land law after he bought the restaurant building, she said. He made me learn it too. He said a woman who doesn't understand how property works is a woman who can be robbed twice. Her jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't wrong. Silas looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. A careful recalibration, like a man adjusting the weight he'd assigned something without telling anyone he'd been doing the math. I'll think about what you said, he told her. He left. Lydia turned back to the bread. Her heart was going a little faster than it should have been, and she noticed this and chose to ignore it. The week that followed was outwardly normal. 3 meals a day, the rhythms of the kitchen, the slow accumulation of small things that add up to a place feeling like somewhere worth being. But underneath it, something had shifted in the air of Stone Ridge Ranch, and Lydia could feel it even when she couldn't name the source. The men felt it too. She could tell by the way conversations changed in the dining hall, more openly, less guarded, the way people talk when they're in a place where they've unconsciously decided they don't have to perform as much. Stories started appearing. Not confessions or anything dramatic, just the ordinary currency of men who'd stopped being strangers to each other in the way that had hardened over the past 4 years. Torres told a story at dinner one Thursday that was so deeply unflattering to himself, involving a horse, a fence gate, and a comprehensive loss of dignity, that 3 men choked on their food laughing. Pete Darrow told a story about a cattle drive in 1871 that nobody quite believed but everyone listened to, leaning forward over their empty plates. Even Burke and Sellers, who had moved from the same table to an actual back-and-forth exchange by the 3rd week, managed something almost cordial over a disagreement about which pasture had better grass quality. Lydia watched all of this and cooked and said little. She noticed other things too. A buckboard wagon that came down the ranch road on Tuesday afternoon and stopped at the edge of the yard. The man who got out wasn't a hand she recognized. He was well dressed for the area. in a dark coat that suggested purpose rather than weather. He spoke to Torres briefly, and Torres pointed toward the main house, and the man went there. He was inside for 20 minutes. When he came out, his face was arranged in the careful neutral of a professional who doesn't let results show before he's been paid. A lawyer. She was almost certain of it. She was in the kitchen doorway, ostensibly checking the flu draft, when Silas came back across the yard afterward. His face was closed in the way it went when something bad had been confirmed rather than just suspected. He walked past the kitchen without looking her way. That evening, after the hands had eaten and the hall was cleared, Lydia sat at the work table in the kitchen and opened her mother's cookbook to a page in the middle, a page with a recipe for slow-roasted chicken that she knew by heart, could have cooked blindfolded, but sometimes still read because her mother's handwriting was there in the margins. Small notes and adjustments made over years. And there was comfort in that even when there wasn't comfort anywhere else. In her mother's handwriting, beside a note about time, the kitchen is where the truth lives. The dining room is where people decide what to do with it. Lydia closed the book and sat quietly for a while. The kitchen was warm. Through the window, she could hear the bunkhouse settling into its nighttime sounds. Somewhere on the ranch, a door banged in the wind and then went quiet. She thought about what Torres had said. Things worth noticing. She thought about the lawyer's face coming out of the main house. She thought about Silas walking across the yard with that closed-off look and the way his whole body carried the weight of something he couldn't put down. She thought about her mother's restaurant and Raymond changing the lock and the lawyer who'd told her it was too late. She put her hand flat on the cover of the cookbook and kept it there for a moment. Then she stood up, banked the range fire for the night, and went to her room. She had breakfast to start at 4 in the morning. And she had thinking to do between now and then. Careful, useful thinking. About registration logs. About transfer periods. About what kind of paperwork could be inserted into county records if someone had the right connections and the right moment of vulnerability. And about what it would take to find a thread and pull on it without anyone noticing who was pulling. She was a cook. She knew that. But she'd also grown up watching her father read land law at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and a woman behind him who knew that the most important room in any house wasn't the one where people made decisions. It was the one where they fed each other. And Lydia Mercer had never, in 29 years, confused feeding people with staying out of their troubles. The coyote called again outside once, and then went quiet. Lydia lay in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her, and started making a different kind of list than the ones she made for grocery orders. This one had no flour on it. This one had names. The list she'd made in her head that night had 4 names on it by morning. Calvin Harlow, the lawyer in the dark coat. Frank, whoever Frank was, the man from the office window conversation. The one who'd said it smells like something that was waiting for the right moment. And Hector Vine, the cook who disappeared in the middle of the night after 6 years without a word. She turned those 4 names over while she worked the breakfast prep, the way her tongue finds a loose tooth without meaning to. The range was running properly now. She'd cleaned the flue herself one afternoon while Noah held the ladder and tried not to ask too many questions. And the kitchen had the particular organized aliveness of a place that had been wrestled back into shape. It still wasn't perfect. The pantry shelves were uneven, and one of the oven doors ran 20 degrees hot, and the back window had a crack in the frame that let in cold air when the wind came from the north. But it was hers, in the way a kitchen becomes yours after enough early mornings alone in it, and she moved through it without thinking, which left her mind free. Hector Vine bothered her most. Not the mystery of him exactly, but the detail Torres had given her. Men like that don't just disappear. 6 years on a ranch. Everyone's name, everyone's coffee. Torres hadn't said that like he was speaking generally. He'd said it like he was speaking from specific knowledge of a specific person. Like he missed him. Like the disappearance had left something torn in the fabric of the place that hadn't healed. She set the coffee on and went back to the eggs. Noah came in at his usual time, 5:15, which she'd stopped noting as early because it seemed to simply be his habit. He arrived before the others because he wasn't sleeping well and the kitchen was warm and she didn't send him away. He'd become useful without either of them formally acknowledging it. He knew where things were now. He could start the coffee if she was occupied elsewhere, and he'd learned without being told that the grits needed watching or they'd scorch on the bottom. He was not a natural cook, but he was a natural at wanting to be helpful, which was a different thing and in some ways rarer. "You're thinking hard this morning," he said, settling onto the stool near the work table. I'm always thinking. Yeah, but this is different thinking. Your face goes a specific way. She glanced at him. What way? Like you're adding numbers that don't add up yet, but you think they will eventually. He reached for the coffee pot and poured himself a cup without asking, which she'd stopped caring about. My grandmother used to look like that right before she said something that turned out to be exactly right. Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. She was the smartest person I ever knew, he said simply. She died 2 years ago. I came out here after. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. People came out to places like Stone Ridge for the same handful of reasons, and grief was always on the list. She turned the eggs. Noah, what do you know about Hector Vine? He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was staring into his coffee cup with the expression of someone deciding something. Not much, he said finally. That's not quite the same as nothing. Another pause. He was a good man. That's what everyone says who knew him longer than me. I only overlapped with him for about 3 months before he left. He looked up. He was scared of something in those last few weeks. I don't know what. He stopped sitting with the other men at meals, and he'd been doing that for 6 years. He started keeping to himself. And then one morning, he was just gone. Did he say anything to you in those 3 months? Noah thought about it. He took this seriously, she noticed, the act of remembering. He didn't just give her the first thing that came to mind. Once, he said. We were out by the smokehouse. He was checking the inventory and I was helping stack. He said, out of nowhere, he said, when something doesn't smell right, it usually isn't. Like he was telling me something while being able to say he wasn't telling me anything. Noah looked at her steadily. I didn't know what he meant then. I've been thinking about it since. Lydia nodded slowly. Don't mention we talked about this, she said. I wasn't going to, Noah said. Calvin Harlow arrived on a Wednesday. Lydia didn't know he was coming. Nobody told her, which she understood. She was the cook, and a visiting rancher's arrival wasn't kitchen business. She found out because she could see the yard from the kitchen window, and at 11:30 a buckboard came down the road followed by a second, more enclosed wagon, and the man who stepped down from the first buckboard was not someone she'd seen before, but carried himself in the particular way of men who are used to being the most important person in the room they're currently entering. He was older than she'd pictured, past 60, heavy-set, with a white hat he didn't remove when he stepped into the yard. 2 men came with him, one of them, the dark-coated lawyer she'd identified by his exit from the main house 3 weeks earlier. The other was younger, built for intimidation rather than thought, standing slightly behind and to the right of Harlow in a way that announced his function without requiring words. Torres met them in the yard. She watched through the window. She was making bread and could watch without appearing to watch. As Torres and Harlow exchanged words she couldn't hear. Torres's posture was correct and unrevealing. Harlow gestured toward the main house. Torres went inside, presumably to find Silas. She had 12 minutes before she needed to put the bread in the oven. She used them. She went to the door of the kitchen that opened onto the side of the yard, the one she used to take scraps to the smokehouse, and she swept the step, slowly, methodically, the broom making its domestic noise, while watching Harlow in her peripheral vision. He hadn't gone inside yet. He was standing in the yard with his lawyer talking in a low voice, and the lawyer was showing him something on a folded piece of paper. Harlow said something and tapped the paper twice with 2 fingers, a gesture that meant this is what matters in any language. The lawyer nodded. Harlow folded the paper and put it inside his coat. Then Harlow turned his head and looked directly at her. She kept sweeping. He looked at her for a moment the way men like Harlow look at women like Lydia, estimating without engaging, filing under irrelevant, and then turned back to his lawyer. She went inside and put the bread in the oven. When Silas came to find her 40 minutes later, she was at the work table planning the dinner menu, and she could tell by the way he came through the door that whatever had happened in the main house had not gone well. Harlow wants to meet in my office to discuss terms, he said. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, turning it, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was working very hard at not showing something. His lawyer has a county document, apparently a recorded deed amendment from 1878 that resurveys the eastern boundary and places it 60 yards west of where I've always understood it to be. If it's valid, I lose the eastern pasture, the summer grazing rights, and access to the creek that feeds it. She kept her eyes on the menu she was writing. Does it look valid? My lawyer hasn't seen it. Frank is sending for him from town, but he won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest. He stopped turning his hat. Harlow wants an answer today. Of course he does, she said. Silas looked at her. I can't give him one, not without legal counsel. Then don't give him one today. She set down her pencil. Mr. Boone, Harlow came here expecting to conduct business in your office, on his schedule, with his lawyer present and yours absent. That's not a negotiation. That's an ambush with paperwork. She kept her voice level. Don't let it happen in your office. He waited. She took a breath. What she was about to say was either going to be received as useful or as extraordinarily presumptuous, and she was gambling on useful. Let it happen at the dinner table instead. The dinner table, he repeated. Tonight, invite him to stay. Invite the lawyer. Feed them the best meal this kitchen can produce and put everyone in the same room for 2 hours before anyone discusses terms. She looked at him directly. Men who eat together before they argue make different arguments than men who walk into a room already fighting. And while everyone is comfortable in talking, I will be serving the meal. And I notice things. A silence that felt long to her, though she didn't let it show. You're talking about sitting across a dinner table from Calvin Harlow and trying to find something I can use, he said. I'm talking about cooking dinner, she said carefully. That's my job. He looked at her for another long moment. She couldn't read his face clearly. She never quite could. It was one of the more frustrating things about him. But something in it had shifted from when he'd walked in. Not lighter exactly, just different. I'll need you to make enough for 5, he said. He brought 2 men. I know, she said. I saw them arrive. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. She turned to the larder and started recalculating what she had. She was going to need the good cuts. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of focused preparation that Noah, who drifted in and out of the kitchen, running her errands to the smokehouse and the root cellar, later described to Torres as like watching someone get ready for something that wasn't cooking but looked exactly like cooking. Torres told Noah that sounded about right. What Lydia was doing, underneath the roasting and the setting of the good table she'd found in the storage room and the careful selection of every element of the meal, was preparing herself to be invisible. To be so much a part of the background of the room that 5 men would forget she was there. People forgot cooks. They forgot the hands that poured the water and brought the plates and moved quietly around the edges of things. She'd learned this early, and she'd learned it worked in both directions. You could be overlooked, or you could choose to not be seen. They felt different from the inside. She chose not to be seen. The roast went into the oven at 3. She made a sauce from drippings and the dried herbs she'd been cultivating on the windowsill. Her small rebellion against whoever had let the kitchen go entirely practical. And a potato dish that was simple enough to not require attention during serving, but substantial enough to anchor a table. Cornbread, again, because she'd seen Silas eat 3 pieces of it at Sunday's dinner when he thought nobody was watching, and she wanted something on this table that was his without being obvious about it. She set the table in the main house dining room herself. This was not where she usually worked. The hands ate in the hall, and this room with its 4 chairs and the empty 5th chair at one end that she had understood without being told had been Margaret Boone's, was only used for occasions. She dusted the table herself, set it with the good plates she found in the sideboard, put candles in the holders not for romance but for practical light, and the unconscious effect that candlelight has on human conversation, which is to slow it down and soften the edges. She was in the kitchen adjusting the sauce when she heard them come through the front of the house. Harlow's voice was the loudest, not because he was shouting, but because he talked with the volume of a man who'd never had to make himself heard, because rooms arranged themselves around him without being asked. She listened to the movements. Silas, quieter, directing them to the dining room. The creak of chairs. A pause, which she imagined was the moment when men who'd arrived ready for combat found themselves sitting in front of a set table and had to adjust their internal footing. She carried the first course in herself. The room when she entered it was carefully arranged in its tensions. Harlow at the far end, in the chair across from Silas, who sat at the head. The lawyer, whose name she'd found from Torres, was Aldrich Porter, to Harlow's right, with a leather case on the floor beside his chair that presumably contained the document. The large young man whose name she still didn't know sat to Harlow's left with the expression of someone told to be present, but not to speak. Silas was at the head of his own table looking like a man who'd accepted a battle on unfavorable ground and was making the best of it. She set the soup down. A simple, clear broth because first courses should not distract. They should relax. And moved around the table with the focus of someone doing a practical job. She did not make eye contact with anyone. She refilled the water. She retreated to the kitchen. She listened through the kitchen door, which she left 3 inches open. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation was territorial. Men who don't know each other well enough to be genuine, filling the air with the weather, the cattle market, the state of the roads between here and the county seat. Harlow's voice carried most of it. He told a story about a land deal in the southern part of the county that took 5 minutes and seemed designed primarily to establish that he had done large things and been involved in significant matters. Silas responded in short sentences. Porter, the lawyer, said almost nothing, but she heard the occasional sound of him shifting in his chair, the sound of a man who is there to do a job and is waiting to do it. She brought the main course in 20 minutes after the soup, the roast, sliced properly, with the sauce on the side, because she'd learned a long time ago that you give people control over the sauce, and they feel like they're choosing something even when everything else is decided. The potatoes. The cornbread covered, so the warmth stayed in. Harlow looked at the plate when she set it in front of him. Just a glance, but genuine. The involuntary attention that good-smelling food produces in people who weren't expecting it. He said to Silas, "Your cook's been busy." "She has," Silas said. She went back to the kitchen. The door stayed 3 inches open. By the time the main course was half consumed, the conversation had changed register in the way conversations change register when people have been warm and fed for half an hour. Less formal, less performed, still careful, but no longer entirely armored. Harlow was talking about his own ranch, its history, a drought 3 years back that had cost him 200 head. Not boasting this time. Just talking, the way a man talks when his guard has come down a fraction without his permission. She waited. And then, 25 minutes into the main course, it happened. Not loudly. Not in a way she might have caught if she'd been in the kitchen clattering dishes. Harlow said something to Porter in a lower voice, and Porter responded in an even lower one, and she caught only fragments. The transfer period. And then Porter's voice, nearly inaudible, before Wills retired. And then Harlow's voice dropping further still, the voice of a man who thinks he's completely private. Should have been long enough ago that nobody... She stood absolutely still on her side of the door. Wills. Before Wills retired. She knew that name from her father's land law study, or thought she did, or maybe from something else, something she'd read or heard in passing. A county registrar? A land records official? She pressed it into her memory and went to get the dessert. When she returned to the dining room with the apple cake she'd had in reserve, the table had shifted into its third and final configuration, the one where business was going to be discussed, because the meal was ending and the purpose of the meeting was reasserting itself through the comfortable warmth of the food. Porter was opening his leather case. Harlow was sitting back in his chair with the unhurried manner of a man who believes he holds all the cards and is simply waiting for the other person to accept it. She set the cake at the center of the table, and then she did something she hadn't planned. She looked at Silas. Not a meaningful look, nothing that would register to anyone else in the room. Just the look a cook gives a host to indicate that the meal is complete and does he need anything further. But she held it a moment longer than she needed to, and in that moment she saw that he was already watching her, and something in his face had a question in it. She gave him the smallest possible nod. Less than a gesture, really. Just the suggestion of one. His eyes stayed on her for another second. Then he turned to Harlow and said, "Mr. Harlow, I appreciate you coming in person, and I appreciate the patience you've shown sitting down to dinner first. I'll look at whatever documentation you have." He picked up his fork. "After dessert." Harlow looked mildly surprised but not displeased. He nodded. "After dessert," he agreed. Porter closed the leather case again. Lydia retreated to the kitchen. She stood at the range and breathed slowly and tried to organize what she'd heard into a shape that made sense. Transfer period. Before Wills retired. A county land records official who was no longer in office, during a period when records were changing hands, when the physical documents would have been moving between desks, between boxes, between the filing system of one administration and the next. AJP. A window. The kind of window that a person with the right access and the right motivation might use to insert a document that looked like it had always been there. She was guessing. She knew she was guessing. She had fragments, not evidence. She had the memory of a low conversation through a 3-inch gap in a kitchen door, and a name she wasn't even certain she'd heard correctly. But her father had always said, sitting at his kitchen table with his land law books, his coffee going cold, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, "You don't need the whole story to know the story is wrong. You just need the one thing that doesn't belong." She heard the dining room chairs pushing back. The meeting was progressing. She put the kettle on for coffee and waited. It was an hour before Silas came to the kitchen. She heard Harlow and his men leave before that, the rumble of the wagon, the sound of hooves diminishing. And then the house went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that follows a difficult encounter. She'd kept herself busy in the kitchen, washing up from the dinner, reorganizing the larder shelf nearest the window, tasks that didn't require thought because she needed her thought for other things. When Silas came through the kitchen door, he looked older than he had at the start of the evening. Not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of change a person who didn't watch people would catch. But she watched people. He sat down at the work table without being invited, which he'd never done before. She set a cup of coffee in front of him. He stared at it. "The document looks legitimate," he said. "On its face. My name, the acreage, the survey numbers. Everything laid out properly. But my lawyer isn't here yet to tell me whether it actually is." He picked up the coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. "Harlow wants a written response by Monday. His lawyer says if I don't acknowledge the boundary revision by then, they'll file for a formal hearing." "A formal hearing takes time," she said. "Time I can be less certain I have than I'd like." His voice was level but not comfortable. "If this drags out in court, the bank gets nervous. The bank gets nervous and—" He stopped. She sat down across from him. She wouldn't have done it a month ago. She did it now without thinking about whether it was appropriate, and he didn't appear to register it as unusual. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to understand that I may be completely wrong about this, and what I'm going to say is based on very little." He looked at her. She told him what she'd heard through the door. Exactly what she'd heard. No additions, no interpretation yet. The transfer period, Porter's comment, the name Wills, Harlow's voice dropping when he said should have been long enough ago that nobody. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "Wills," Silas said. It wasn't a question exactly. "Clement Wills," she said. "I've been trying to remember where I know that name from. I think he was the county registrar in this district. Through the mid-70s. He retired sometime around 1878 or 1879, I believe. I'm not certain of the exact year." Silas was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that first night across the dining hall. The look that couldn't quite categorize what it was seeing. "You heard all of that through the kitchen door," he said. "I heard fragments through the kitchen door," she said. "I'm telling you what I think they add up to. I might be wrong. But if you're not wrong, if I'm not wrong, someone with access to the county records during the transition when Wills left office inserted a document into the land registry that wasn't there when the original survey was filed. And if that's true, there's a physical register, a log of document additions, that should show the sequence number of every entry. If the deed amendment was added during that window, its sequence number won't match its supposed date. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. She'd had silences with Silas Boone that were full of different things: his grief, his caution, his slow, careful way of moving toward trust. And she was learning to read them the way she read her kitchen, by what they contained rather than what they seemed from outside. This one was the silence of a man taking something seriously. "The county registrar's office keeps those logs," he said slowly, "but accessing them requires someone to go to the county seat and ask to see the land registration records for the transfer period of 1878. She met his eyes. "Frank, the man you were speaking with, the one who told you it smells like something was waiting for the right moment. He said he hadn't been able to get his hands on Harlow's document. Could he get to the county seat?" "Frank's in town now," Silas said. "He could leave tomorrow. Then he should take your lawyer with him and look at the registration log for all property amendments filed under the Stone Ridge survey number during the period from late 1877 through the end of 1879. She held his gaze. "If the document is forged, the sequence number will tell the story. It won't match the other entries from 1878. It'll be inserted. It'll look like 1878, but it'll be filed in the wrong order." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The oil lamp between them made the shadows in the kitchen flicker. "My lawyer might have already thought of this," he said. "He might have," she agreed. "But it won't hurt for Frank to be there looking at the same records. He nodded slowly. There's one other thing, he said. Harlow's lawyer, Porter. The way he was talking about the document, like he knew exactly where it was in the records because he'd put it there. He stopped. I noticed that during dinner, the way he moved when the document came up. Too comfortable, like a man who knows where all the furniture is because he arranged it himself. I noticed that too, she said. They looked at each other across the work table, across the coffee cups, and the remnants of an evening that had turned into something neither of them had planned, and she saw something on his face that had been very carefully absent for as long as she'd known him. Not hope exactly. Something more tentative than hope and more honest. The possibility that this might not be over yet. I'll send a wire to Frank tonight, he said. He pushed back from the table. And Lydia. She'd started clearing the cups. She stopped. I don't know, he said, and then stopped and started again. I'm not sure what to do with the fact that the dinner, what you did tonight, the reason for it. He looked at her with the directness that was simply how he operated, no deflection in it. Most people in your position would have stayed in the kitchen. I was in the kitchen, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost the same almost smile she'd seen weeks before, slightly further along this time. You know what I mean, he said. I do, she said. And I know why you're saying it, because it's strange that a woman you hired to cook is now in the middle of something that's none of her business. Is that what you think I'm saying? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I think you're saying thank you in the way people say thank you. When the thing they're grateful for is also something they don't quite know what to do with. He looked at her for a long moment. That's accurate, he said. Then he put on his hat and went to send the wire. Lydia cleared the work table and blew out the lamp over the sink and stood for a moment in the kitchen that smelled of roast and candle smoke and the faint sawdust warmth of the range burning low. She thought about Hector Vine, who had noticed something and then disappeared. She thought about her father's voice. You don't need the whole story to know the story is wrong. She thought about the name Porter had used, Wills, and the moment Harlow's voice had dropped, and what it meant that a powerful man felt the need to lower his voice in what he believed was a private room. Powerful men who believed themselves safe still lowered their voices, which meant some part of Calvin Harlow, underneath the white hat and the lawyer and the manufactured paperwork, knew that what he was doing was the kind of thing that could be undone by the right person asking the right question at the right time. She went to her room. Outside, the Texas dark was absolute and enormous, the kind of dark that makes a person feel very small and very clear at the same time, and somewhere out past the east pasture, the 40 acres Harlow wanted, the 40 acres of summer grass and creek access, and 12 years of Silas Boone's careful work. A night bird was calling into the silence. Lydia listened to it for a moment. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. Frank Collier left for the county seat at first light on Thursday. Lydia knew this because she was already at the range when she heard the horse go out, single rider, moving at pace, the sound of it different from the usual morning movement of the ranch hands heading to pasture. She watched through the kitchen window as the shape of a man on horseback diminished against the pale early sky, and she went back to the coffee without saying anything to anyone. Silas had moved fast. She hadn't expected him to move quite that fast, and she found she respected it in the uncomplicated way you respect someone for doing the right thing without making a production of it. He'd sent the wire the previous night, and Frank had apparently been ready, which meant Frank had been waiting to be pointed at something for a while. She made breakfast. She fed 32 men. She cleaned the kitchen and started on the lunch prep. She didn't tell Noah what had happened the previous evening. She didn't tell Torres. She wasn't sure exactly what had happened herself. She had fragments, a theory, the memory of 2 low voices through a 3-inch door gap. And telling people things you weren't certain of was how rumors started, and rumors in a place like Stone Ridge would travel faster than Frank's horse and do considerably more damage. What she did was cook, and watch, and wait. Waiting was something she'd never been naturally good at. Her mother had been a patient woman, the kind who could let something develop at its own speed without reaching for it. Lydia had always been more like her father, wanting to move toward things, to act, to find the lever, and apply pressure. Waiting felt to her like a waste of motion, and she'd spent 29 years arguing with herself about it with mixed results. But there was nothing to do now except wait, and so she made Thursday's lunch and Friday's dinner and Saturday's breakfast, and she watched the road from the kitchen window every time she passed it, And she did not ask Silas anything because she had used up her allocation of questions for a while and she knew it. On Saturday afternoon, Silas came to the kitchen. He came in the way he always did, direct, no preamble, but this time there was something different in the arrangement of his face. Not the compressed flatness she'd come to read as bad news being managed. Something else. Something she had to look at twice to identify. He sat down at the work table. She set coffee in front of him without being asked, the way she'd stopped asking herself whether it was appropriate to simply do the things she could see needed doing. "Frank wired back this morning," he said. She sat down. The registration log for the Stone Ridge survey number shows one amendment entry during the period from 1877 through the end of 1879. The entry carries a date of October 1878, which would place it squarely during the transfer of records when Wills was leaving and the new registrar was coming in. He paused. The sequence number on the entry is 4847. She waited. The entries on either side of it in the physical log, the ones dated September and November of 1878 respectively, carry sequence numbers 4614 and 4619. His voice was even. A gap of 233 numbers. In a log where consecutive entries across the entire year of 1878 show sequence numbers running in unbroken order with gaps of no more than 3 or 4. She breathed carefully. "The document wasn't filed in October 1878, she said. "According to Frank and my lawyer, who were both standing in the county registrar's office looking at the physical log this morning, no, it wasn't. The sequence number places it much later, probably 1882 or 1883, based on how the numbers were running by then." He picked up the coffee cup. "Someone added an entry to the October 1878 page of the log at a later date and assigned it a number that was out of sequence, either not knowing how to fake the sequence correctly or assuming nobody would ever look that closely." "Porter would know how to look that closely," she said. "He's a lawyer." "My lawyer says Porter may not have had access to the physical log himself. That kind of access requires knowing someone in the registrar's office. It's possible the person who made the entry didn't understand the sequence system." Silas set down the cup. "Or it's possible they thought the sequencing was obscure enough that it would never matter." "It would never matter," Lydia said, "unless someone was specifically looking for it." "Yes." He looked at her, and there was something in the look that she'd started to recognize over the weeks. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of steady acknowledgement. The look of a man who has adjusted how he sees something and is deciding whether to say so. "My lawyer is filing a formal challenge to the document on Monday. He's requesting a full forensic examination of the deed amendment and the registration log entry." He paused. "He says the sequence discrepancy alone is strong enough to compel the court to delay Harlow's filing." "That buys time," she said. "It buys time," he agreed. "But it doesn't end this. Harlow's lawyers will argue against the forensic examination. They'll say the gap in sequence numbers is a clerical error from the transition period. They'll find explanations. And unless we can produce a witness—" He stopped. She was already there ahead of him. "A witness who was present during the actual filing, someone who was working in the registrar's office, or had access to the records during the later period when the document was actually inserted." "My lawyer said the same thing this morning," Silas said. "He has a name. There was a deputy registrar who worked under Clement Wills and stayed on for 2 years after Wills retired. His name is Dillard Crane. He left county employment in 1884, and nobody seems to know exactly where he went." The name meant nothing to her, but something else did. "Hector Vine knew something," she said. Silas went still. "Noah told me Hector was scared in the last weeks before he left. He kept to himself. He stopped sitting with the other men." She held Silas's gaze. He'd been here 6 years. He noticed things. And if Harlow had been working on this land claim for years, positioning it, waiting for the right moment of financial pressure, someone at some point might have said something they shouldn't have, somewhere that Hector could hear. "Cooks hear things," Silas said quietly. "People forget we're in the room," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon had gone gold and slightly hazy, the particular Texas light of late autumn that made distances look both closer and less real. The sound of the hands coming in from the east pasture was starting up, the familiar percussion of a day ending. "Hector," Silas said slowly, "did not leave without reason. I've known that since he left. I should have—" He stopped. "I should have looked harder at why. I was dealing with other things, and I let it go." She didn't say anything to that. He wasn't asking for absolution, and she wasn't in the business of giving it. Do you know where he went? She asked. No. He had no family here. He'd come from somewhere in East Texas originally, I think. I don't know where. He looked at his coffee. Torres might know more. I'll ask Torres, she said. He looked up. Lydia. She waited. You're doing it again, he said, not an accusation, something more careful than that. Doing what? Moving into the middle of something that carries risk. He held her eyes. Harlow is not a man who responds gracefully to being outmaneuvered. If he figures out where the sequence angle came from, if he looks at who was in this house during that dinner and works backward, he saw a cook, she said. He looked at me in the yard and decided I wasn't worth his attention in about 4 seconds. I know, but if that changes, she said, I'll still have been right about the sequence numbers. Silas looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through something, some internal argument that had more than one side to it. He had the face of a man who'd spent 4 years making every decision by himself and was finding it genuinely disorienting to share the weight of something, not because sharing was wrong, but because he'd forgotten how it felt and wasn't sure yet whether he was doing it correctly. Talk to Torres, he said finally, but carefully. She nodded. He stood, took his hat from the peg, and then paused with his hand on the kitchen door. The dinner on Wednesday, he said without turning around. It was the right call. I didn't fully understand why until I was in that room and realized that Harlow had come in expecting a fight and found a table instead. It knocked him off his angle. He pushed the door open. I owe you for that. You owe me Tuesday's supply order, she said. We're nearly out of cornmeal. He muttered a sound she'd never heard from him before. Brief, almost rusty. The sound of a man who'd laughed before and was remembering how, and went out. She sat at the work table and drank what was left of her coffee, which had gone cold. It tasted fine. Why? Torres was harder to approach than Noah, because Torres was the kind of man who knew when he was being approached and made you work for it on principle. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just careful, in the way that men who've seen a lot become careful, not suspicious of specific things, but just generally aware that things can go sideways without announcement. She waited until Sunday morning, when the hands had a lighter schedule, and Torres came into the kitchen at a more relaxed hour than usual. She let him get his coffee and sit and say whatever he was going to say, which was, as was typical for Torres, something precise and unhurried, before she said anything herself. He said, Heard Frank went to the county seat. I believe so, she said. Heard he came back with something useful. I don't know the details, she said, which was almost true. Torres looked at her over his cup with the expression of a man who does not believe he is talking to someone who doesn't know the details. He said. She kept working. Then she said, I wanted to ask you about Hector. I thought you might eventually, he said. She turned around. You've been waiting for someone to ask. I've been waiting for the right someone. He set down his cup. The other men, they remember Hector fondly, but they don't think too much past that. He was here and then he wasn't, and in a place like this, people come and go. But I knew Hector for 3 years before things started going strange, and what I know is that he didn't leave because he wanted to. He was scared, she said. I was scared, Torres confirmed. Of what exactly? He wouldn't say straight out. But a month before he left, he asked me a question. He asked me if I knew anything about a man named Crane, Dillard Crane. He watched her face as he said the name. She kept her expression even. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know anyone by that name, which was true. Torres picked up his cup again. He didn't push it, but the way he asked, it wasn't casual. He knew who he was asking about. He was trying to find out if I did. She was quiet for a moment, making herself not reach too fast. Do you know where Hector went after he left here? Torres was quiet for what felt like a long time. The kitchen sounds filled the space between them. The range, the settling of the house, the distant sound of horses being brought in. He had a cousin, Torres said finally, in a town called Mira Wells, south of here, maybe 60 miles. I didn't mention it to anyone because Hector asked me not to if anyone came looking. He said if someone came asking specifically about him and whether he'd left on good terms, not to tell them. He paused. You're not asking me that. No, she said. I'm asking because I think Hector might know something that matters, something that could protect this ranch. Torres looked at her steadily. If I tell you where to find him, you're going to bring this to Silas. I already have, in general terms. He doesn't know about the cousin. Another long pause. Then Torres said, Mira Wells, his cousin's name is Elena Vasquez. She runs a boarding house on the south end of town. Lydia nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Hector was scared enough to leave in the middle of the night after 6 years. Whatever he knows, whatever he saw or heard, it was bad enough that he decided disappearing was safer than staying. He held her gaze. I'd think carefully about how you approach that. I will, she said. Torres finished his coffee, stood up, and settled his hat on his head. You're a better cook than Hector was, he said, which from Torres was clearly the highest available compliment. And Hector was a good cook. He left. She stood at the range and did not move for a moment. Mira Wells, 60 miles south. What? She told Silas that evening. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his highest form of taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, I'll go. I thought you might say that, she said. I'd suggest Frank goes instead. He looked at her. If you ride into Mira Wells yourself, you're Silas Boone, rancher with a land dispute, coming to ask a former employee to testify. That's pressure, whether you mean it that way or not. She kept her voice level. If Frank goes, as a friend, quietly, it's a different conversation. He sat with that for a moment. Frank's a good man, he said. But Hector doesn't know him. He knows you sent him. That should be enough, if Frank explains the situation honestly. She paused. And honestly is the right approach. No promises about what happens if Hector helps. No threats about what happens if he doesn't. Just the truth about what's at stake and the choice being his. Silas was quiet again. Then, you think an honest approach will be enough? I think it's the only one that might work, she said. A man who left in the middle of the night because he was scared. You're not going to buy his testimony. You're not going to frighten it out of him. The only thing that has a chance of working is telling him the truth and letting him decide. He looked at her steadily. You have a lot of faith in the truth as a practical instrument. I have a lot of experience with what happens when it's not used, she said. My family's restaurant is a good example. Something crossed his face. Not pity, which she'd have hated, but the particular recognition of one person who has lost something to another. He nodded once. I'll send Frank tomorrow. The week that followed was the hardest of the time she'd been at Stone Ridge, and not because of the land dispute. It was hard because nothing happened. Frank rode south on Monday. Silas's lawyer filed the challenge on Monday as well, and the court's response, which came back by wire on Wednesday, was to grant a 30-day delay on Harlow's formal filing pending examination of the documentation. This was good news, Silas told her, delivered with the flatness of a man for whom good news had become a thing to be cautious about. Harlow's response was swift and ugly. On Thursday, one of the hands came in from the east pasture to report that someone had knocked down a quarter-mile of fence line along the boundary between Stone Ridge and Harlow's property overnight. No cattle had been moved, but the message was clear. The land the fence had marked was being contested in more ways than one. Torres went out with 4 men and spent all day Thursday rebuilding the fence. When he came back to dinner, he was quiet in the particular way that Torres got quiet when he was controlling something significant, and he ate without speaking to anyone except to ask Noah to pass the bread. Lydia made sure dinner was good that night. Not performatively good. She didn't have the energy for performance, but the kind of solid, unremarkable abundance that says this place is still standing and you are still fed. She put an extra pot of coffee on at the end and kept it hot longer than usual, and several men sat at the table past when they'd normally have left, not talking about much, just sitting in a place that was warm and still. She thought about Margaret Boone, who had been the reason the place felt like a place. She thought she understood better now what Noah had meant. On Friday, a message came from Frank, not a wire. An actual letter, which meant Frank had been somewhere without wire access or had wanted to say things that wires weren't right for. Silas read it in his office and then came to the kitchen and sat down and read parts of it to her, which she understood was a kind of trust she hadn't been explicitly offered before and didn't acknowledge out loud because naming it would make it awkward. Frank had found Hector Vine. I was in Mira Wells at his cousin Elena's boarding house, exactly where Torres had said. He was working, doing kitchen and maintenance work for Elena, keeping his head down, not talking to strangers about where he'd come from. He had lost weight, Frank wrote. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time in a space that was too small for it. Frank had told him straight why he'd come. About the sequence number, about the court challenge, about what was at stake for Stone Ridge. Hector had listened without speaking, and then he'd said he needed to think about it, and Frank should come back the next day. Silas looked up from the letter. Frank went back the next day, he said. And? She kept her voice steady. Silas looked back at the letter. Frank's handwriting was large and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man who didn't write frequently. Hector told him what he knows. Frank wrote it down, but I'll give you the short version. He folded the letter carefully. In the spring of 1882, a man came to the Stone Ridge kitchen. He said he was a surveyor doing updates on boundary records for the county. Hector fed him lunch. It was just the two of them in the kitchen. The hands were all out. The man talked, the way people talk when they're comfortable and not thinking about who's in the room. She knew that silence, too. He mentioned Dillard Crane by name, Silas said. He said Crane had helped him get a document placed in the county records, and that the timing had been perfect because of the records transition. He said it would never come to light because it had been too long and the trail was cold. He looked up. He didn't know Hector was listening with the specific kind of attention that Hector apparently listened with. What happened then? She asked. Hector realized what he'd overheard. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know about any land dispute. At that point, it was 3 years before Harlow made any kind of move, and he had no context for what he'd heard. He filed it away. Silas set the letter on the table. Then last year, when Harlow started making noise about the boundary, and the lawyers started showing up, Hector started putting it together. And someone, he doesn't know who, he never saw anyone he could identify, left a note under his kitchen door. No name, just 4 words. She waited. You heard too much. The kitchen was very quiet. He left that night, Silas said. She sat with that for a moment. The note, the 4 words. A man who'd been in the same kitchen she was sitting in now, who'd cooked in the same space, who'd heard something at a lunch table with a stranger and carried it alone for years, until it became something that followed him out in the middle of the night. He's scared to come forward, she said. It wasn't a question. Frank says he's not scared exactly. Frank's word is resigned, like a man who has already decided that speaking up costs more than he has. Silas's jaw was tight. He owes money. Elena's boarding house is struggling. He's been sending back what he earns, which isn't much. Harlow has allies in 2 counties. Hector knows what can happen to a man who testifies against someone with that kind of reach. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What does he need? Silas looked at her. Not to testify. I mean in his actual life right now. What is he carrying that's too heavy? Frank mentioned debt, Silas said slowly. $300 to a supply merchant. He co-signed for Elena's inventory 2 years ago when she was starting up and the business has been slow. $300 was not nothing. It was several months of Lydia's wages. But it was also, she understood, the kind of number that sat on a man and changed how he breathed and made things like speaking the truth feel like luxuries he couldn't afford. She looked at Silas carefully. I'm going to say something that isn't my business. You've made a habit of that, he said, without edge. What if you helped him? Not in exchange for testimony, not as a condition of anything, just help him with the debt. Because he's a man in trouble and you have the means to help, and it's the right thing to do. She kept her eyes on him. No strings. If he chooses to tell the court what he heard in 1882, that's his choice. If he doesn't, the debt is still gone. Silas looked at her for a long time. That's $300, he said. I know. With no guarantee. With no guarantee, she agreed, which is the only way it works. The moment it's a transaction, Hector knows it's a transaction, and a man in his position has heard enough transactions to know what they usually cost him. She leaned forward slightly. You'd be making an argument he hasn't heard before, that someone is willing to help him simply because helping is what you do. The silence that followed was different from all the silences she'd catalogued. This one had weight in it. Not the weight of resistance, but of a man measuring something real against something else real, and not being certain of the scale. My father did something like this once, Silas said, very quietly. A man who worked for him. Got into debt through bad luck, mostly. My father paid it off without conditions. Told him it was because you help people when you can. He stopped. The man worked for my father for 15 more years. Loyal, more than loyal. He looked at the letter on the table. My father said the difference between a favor and a purchase is whether the other person gets to choose what they do after. Your father sounds like a wise man, Lydia said. He had his moments. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and picked up the letter. I'll wire Frank tonight. Tell him to offer the 300 to Hector. No conditions. She nodded. He was at the door when she said Silas. He stopped. She'd used his given name. She wasn't sure she'd done that before, so it was always Mr. Boone, which had always felt like the right distance. She didn't correct herself. Whatever Hector decides, she said. Thank you for trying it this way. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the window above the range and caught the side of his face, the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that were the map of 4 hard years and a loss that hadn't finished being processed. The ranch hands, he said. They're different. The last 2 months, the dining hall, the way the place feels. I want to say, I don't know what changed, but I do know, and it seems dishonest to pretend otherwise. She didn't say anything. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things that aren't about cattle or fences or business, I'm aware of that. You're doing all right, she said. Something crossed his face, not the corner of the mouth movement she'd seen before, but the full version, brief and unguarded, gone before it had quite arrived. He nodded once and left. Lydia sat at the work table in the kitchen that had started to feel like hers in a way she hadn't planned on and didn't quite know what to do with. And she listened to his boots cross the yard toward the main house, and she thought about all the things that were still uncertain. Hector's choice, the court challenge, Harlow's next move, the fence that had been knocked down overnight, and what else might follow it. And then she thought about the sound of 32 men eating dinner in a room that had started, slowly, to feel like somewhere worth being. About Noah Reyes, who'd started asking her questions about technique with the focused hunger of someone who'd discovered what he was supposed to be doing with his hands. About Torres, who told her she was a better cook than Hector and had meant it as the most serious thing he knew how to offer. About Pete Darrow eating his breakfast slowly every morning with that deliberate formality, the small dignity of a man who'd learned to receive good things carefully. About Silas saying, I'm not good at this in a kitchen doorway with the late light on his face. Honest about his limitations in the way that people are honest when they've decided someone is worth being honest with. She got up and started on dinner. She had 32 men to feed, and one man, 60 miles south, sitting in a borrowed room in his cousin's boarding house, holding $300 of unconditional help in his hands, and deciding, in the quiet of a life that had gotten too small, what kind of person he wanted to be when it mattered. She couldn't make that decision for him. But she knew, in the way she knew things she couldn't fully explain, the same way she knew what a kitchen needed before she'd been in it long enough to understand why. She knew that genuine kindness, offered without calculation, had a way of finding the nerve in a person that fear had been pressing on. Not always, not guaranteed, but often enough to try. The range came to heat under her hands. The smell of the evening meal began to fill the kitchen. Outside, the hands were coming in from the pastures, and the sound of Stone Ridge Ranch. Gathering itself for another night rose around her like something she had been part of for much longer than 2 months. She stirred the pot and waited for what came next. The wire came on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after Frank had ridden south. Lydia was at the range when she heard Silas cross the yard from the telegraph office in Decker's Crossing. She knew his walk by now, the particular rhythm of it, unhurried but covering ground. And she heard him come through the front of the main house rather than the kitchen door, which meant whatever the wire said, he needed a moment with it before he came to tell her. She turned the heat down under the pot and waited. He came to the kitchen 12 minutes later. She knew it was 12 because she'd been watching the clock above the pantry shelf without meaning to, the way you watch things when you're trying not to. He stood in the doorway. His face was not the compressed flatness of bad news, and it was not the careful, almost expression of cautious good news. It was something she hadn't seen on him before, and it took her a moment to identify it. It was relief. Plain and unperformed and slightly unsteady, the way relief looks on a person who has been holding something for so long that putting it down affects their balance. Hector's coming, he said. She set down the spoon she was holding. Frank says he accepted the help. The debt's cleared. Silas came into the kitchen and sat down, which was his habit now. Not asking, just sitting, which she'd stopped noting as anything other than how things were between them. He said he'd come to the county seat to speak with the court examiner, voluntarily, no conditions. When? she asked. End of the week. Frank's riding back with him. She turned back to the range because she needed somewhere to put her face for a moment. She stirred the pot that didn't need stirring. Outside the kitchen window, the November morning was pale and cold, and the yard was empty. The hands already out at the pastures, and the quiet of the ranch in mid-morning had a quality she'd come to think of as the ranch's truest sound. Not the busy noise of meals and movement, but this, the working silence of a place that was still going. He chose it himself, she said. Not a question. Frank was clear that he didn't have to, Silas said. He said Hector sat with the money for 2 days before he gave Frank his answer. 2 days of just living with the fact that someone had helped him without wanting anything back. He was quiet for a moment. Frank said when Hector finally said yes, he didn't explain himself much. He just said, I've been carrying this long enough. She thought about that. A man in a small borrowed room with $300 on the table and the weight of something he'd heard in a kitchen 6 years ago, trying to figure out what kind of person he was willing to be. The carrying of it, alone, in the dark, far from the place where it had started. And then the moment of deciding to put it down. She understood that in a way she couldn't have explained without talking about Raymond and the locked door and $41 and 9 miles of Texas road, and she didn't need to explain it. Good, she said simply. Hector Vine arrived at Stone Ridge on a Friday afternoon, which Lydia knew because Torres came into the kitchen in the middle of her bread making and said, He's here, in the tone of someone for whom those 2 words carried a great deal of history. She didn't go out to the yard. It wasn't her reunion. It was Torres's, and the other men who'd known Hector, and Silas's in whatever form that took. She stayed in the kitchen and finished the bread and listened to the sounds from the yard with one part of her attention while the rest of her stayed on the dough. Hector came to the kitchen an hour later. He came alone, which she thought said something about him, that he'd found his way here without being directed, that the kitchen was still the place he oriented toward. He was a compact man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work, even though his job had always been indoor, the way outdoor weather finds people who live in its proximity, regardless. He was thinner than the man Torres had described from memory, and he held himself with the careful posture of someone who'd been braced for something for a long time and hadn't fully remembered how to stand without it yet. He stopped inside the kitchen door and looked around. She watched him take it in. The reorganized shelves, the repaired flue, the potted herbs on the windowsill, the general evidence of a kitchen that had been inhabited and worked and brought back from 3 weeks of neglect into something functional and particular. You changed the flour bin to the other side, he said. The original position was too far from the range, she said, made for a lot of back and forth. He nodded slowly. I thought about moving it once. Never got around to it. He looked at her directly. You're Lydia Mercer. I am. Torres told me about you, said you were better than me. Torres told me the same thing in reverse, she said. I think he was being diplomatic in both directions. Something moved in Hector's face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the suggestion that smiling was something he'd done before and might do again eventually. He came in and sat at the work table, the same spot Silas always chose, and she put coffee in front of him the same way. He wrapped his hands around the cup. I should have spoken up sooner, he said. I've thought about that every day for 2 years. You were scared, she said. That's not a character flaw, that's information. Scared men let bad things keep going, he said. Sometimes, she said. And sometimes scared men carry something alone for years because the cost of speaking is too high for one person to bear, and then someone comes along and changes the arithmetic. She looked at him steadily. You're speaking now. I was quiet for a moment. Silas Boone paid off Elena's debt, he said. No conditions. She doesn't even know why. She thinks it was a church thing, some kind of charity. I didn't correct her. He looked at his coffee. A man does something like that. No conditions. It changes the math. Like you said. It was his idea, Lydia said, which was not entirely true but was true enough in the ways that mattered. Hector looked at her with the particular expression of someone who doesn't fully believe what they've just been told but appreciates the reason for it. Right, he said. They sat in the kitchen together for a while. 2 cooks in a space that held the memory of both of them. And she told him about the sequence numbers and what Frank and the lawyer had found. And he listened with the focused attention of someone who'd been waiting to understand the full shape of something he'd only ever seen part of. When she finished, he said, The man who came for lunch in 1882, He didn't give me his name, but he was about 40, red hair going gray, good boots. Called himself a surveyor. He paused. He wasn't nervous. That's the part that stayed with me. He talked like a man who'd already decided the risk was zero. Like whatever he'd done, he was certain it was buried too deep to matter. It almost was, she said. Almost, he agreed. Hector spoke to the court examiner the following Wednesday at the county seat, with Silas's lawyer present. The deposition took 3 hours. Lydia wasn't there. She was at Stone Ridge feeding 32 men lunch and dinner. But Silas came back that evening and sat at the work table and told her what had happened in the careful, detailed way he'd developed for telling her things, as though he'd learned that she needed the specifics and had decided to provide them. Hector had given his testimony clearly and without embellishment. He described the lunch, the man's appearance, the conversation he'd overheard, the name Crane that the man had mentioned. He was cross-examined by Harlow's lawyer, who tried 3 different angles to suggest that a former ranch cook's memory of a conversation from 6 years ago was unreliable, and Hector answered each one in the same calm, direct way, without defensiveness, without elaboration. The testimony of a man who was telling what he knew and nothing beyond it. The forensic examiner's report on the deed amendment came back the same week. The findings confirmed the sequence number discrepancy. The paper used in the amendment was consistent with materials available in the early 1880s, not the late 1870s when the document was supposed to have been filed. The ink showed characteristics inconsistent with documents from that period, according to an expert the court had consulted from Austin. The document was forged. Silas said this at the work table on a Thursday evening, flat and simple, the way he said things that were large, without drama, because the drama was already in the fact. Porter's license is under review, he said. The court examiner has referred the case for criminal investigation. Harlow's lawyer, his real one, the one in the city, withdrew from the land dispute case this morning. He paused. Word from Frank is that Harlow's been trying to reach Porter, and Porter isn't answering. Rats leaving a ship, she said. Something like that. Silas looked at his hands on the table. The court restored the original survey boundary. Full ownership of the eastern pasture confirmed to Stone Ridge Ranch as of this morning. He looked up at her. It's over. She let that settle for a moment. Outside, the evening was doing what Texas evenings in November do, going cold fast, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour, the wind picking up from the north. Through the kitchen window, she could see the last light going out of the sky in the particular way it did out here, that enormous sky that had frightened her when she'd first arrived and had since become something she'd stopped being able to imagine not having overhead. What happens to Harlow? She asked. Legally, that depends on what the investigation finds and whether Porter cooperates with the examiner. The land claim is dead. His political standing... Silas paused. Frank says he's already lost 2 county board appointments. People who were aligned with him are creating distance. That kind of thing tends to move faster than the law. And Dillard Crane? Being looked for. Whether they find him... He shook his head slightly. That's not in my hands. She nodded. She thought about Crane, the man who'd helped slip a document into county records during a transition period, probably for money, probably telling himself it was a small thing. The small things had a way of not staying small. Hector, she said, what is he going to do? I offered him his position back, Silas said. This morning, he said he needed to think about it. He looked at her carefully. I think he might be ready to come back. But I also think he might not be the same man who left. And that's all right. Whatever he chooses. She looked at him across the work table. In 2 months, she'd watched Silas Boone change in ways she didn't think he'd fully registered himself. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone would write down as a transformation, but in the small, persistent ways that actual change happens in actual people. He'd started finishing his meals. He'd started sitting in the dining hall longer than necessary after dinner, not talking much, just present in a way that was different from his previous absence. He'd asked Noah Reyes 2 weeks ago how the boy was doing and then actually waited for the answer rather than treating it as a rhetorical courtesy. I was returning to himself slowly, the way blood returns to a limb that's been without it, unevenly, sometimes painfully, not in a straight line. She thought about Margaret Boone, who she'd never known, and only understood through the shape of what her absence had left. She thought she would have liked her. There's something I've been wanting to say, Silas said. She waited. I was quiet for a moment. in the way that meant he was finding the right words rather than avoiding them. He'd gotten better at finding them over 2 months, though he'd never be a man who found them easily. When you showed up here in September, he said, I thought I was hiring a cook. I thought I needed someone to manage the kitchen and keep the men fed, and that was the job. He looked at her steadily. I had no idea what I was actually opening the gate to. I just cooked, she said. You know that's not accurate, he said, and his voice was quiet but direct. What you did? The dinner? The way you listened? The thing with the sequence numbers? Hector. None of that is just cooking. You saved this ranch. I need to say that plainly, because I'm not always good at saying things plainly when they're personal. She held his gaze. You saved it, she said. You kept it running for 4 years on your own while you were carrying something very heavy. You made the decision about Hector. You sent Frank. You sat at a table with Calvin Harlow and didn't hand over anything. She paused. I just cooked and kept my kitchen door 3 inches open. He looked at her for a long moment. We could argue about this, he said. We could, she agreed. I'd rather not. Then don't, she said. Another silence, and this one was different from all the ones before. Not the absence of words, but the presence of something that had been building for weeks, and neither of them had directly named, the way weather builds before a person looks up and realizes the sky has been changing for a while. Lydia, he said, I'm going to say something, and I want you to take it seriously, rather than immediately redirecting it back at me. She felt something in her chest that was not quite nerves, but in the same neighborhood. All right, she said. I don't want you to stay here as my cook, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The range made its low ticking sound. The north wind moved against the window. She looked at him. I mean that I want you to stay, he said, with the careful precision of a man who has practiced this sentence and is discovering that practice doesn't make it easier. Not as a hired position, not as an employee. He held her gaze and didn't flinch from it, which she'd come to understand was simply how he was. Direct even when directness cost him something. I've been alone for 4 years. I chose to be alone because it seemed like the honest response to losing someone. But something about the last 2 months, he stopped, started again. You made this place feel like a place again, not by fixing it, by being in it. She sat with that. She thought about $41 and a carpet bag and 9 miles of road in the September heat. She thought about her mother's cookbook on the highest shelf and what it had meant to put it there. She thought about the restaurant she'd lost and the restaurant she'd built in her head every day since. The one that lived in the future rather than the past. The one she hadn't quite been able to see clearly yet. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a kitchen that had started to feel like hers, in a place that had started to feel like somewhere, with a man who had just told her something that took courage to say and was now waiting without demanding, which was its own kind of language she was learning. You're not a simple man to be around, she said. I know, he said. I'm not going to argue with that. You're closed off. You hold things in until they've been held so long they've changed shape. Yes, he said, and you've been in love with a memory for 4 years, which is a complicated thing to stand next to. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret was... He stopped. I'm not going to pretend she isn't still something I carry. That wouldn't be honest. But carrying something isn't the same as being unable to carry anything else. She looked at him across the work table, across the coffee cups that had gone cold the way coffee always went cold when they talked. And she thought about what her mother had written in the margin of a recipe for slow-roasted chicken. And the kitchen is where the truth lives. I'm not looking to replace what you had, she said. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something that's its own thing, from here. She looked at her hands on the table. The hands that had made 3 meals a day for 32 men, that had set a table for a hostile dinner and listened through a 3-inch door gap, and written a list with no flour on it, and turned a struggling kitchen back into the heart of a place. I grew up cooking in my mother's restaurant, she said. After she died and then my father, the restaurant was the only thing left that was still them. When Raymond took it, she paused. I thought I was losing everything. The place, the work, the reason for it. All of it gone to someone who didn't deserve it. I know, he said quietly, but I've been thinking lately that I had it slightly wrong. She looked up at him. I didn't lose the work. The work is portable. It goes where I go. The restaurant was a building. The cooking it's something else. It's the thing I do with people. With the people I'm feeding and the place I'm feeding them in. She looked around the kitchen, The organized shelves, the herbs on the sill, the range that ran properly now, the cup hooks she'd added beside the window. I've built something here. It's not mine legally, but it's mine in the way things are yours when you've put yourself into them. It can be yours legally, he said, if you're willing. She looked at him. That's not, he paused. That's not a transaction. I want to be clear about that. I know it's not, she said. Is that a yes? He asked. And then immediately, you don't have to. Silas, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said. Hector Vine came back to Stone Ridge in December, not as the kitchen cook. That was Lydia's kitchen now, and everyone, including Hector, understood it, but as something the ranch hadn't had a position for before and had to invent. A general hand who knew every person's name and preference and helped manage the supply runs and the ordering and the logistics that kept a place like Stone Ridge fed and stocked through winter. Torres called him the quartermaster. Hector said that was a more dignified title than he deserved. Torres said he'd been away too long if he thought Torres handed out titles based on dignity. It was, as far as Lydia could tell, the warmest welcome back she'd ever witnessed from men who would have been embarrassed to call it that. Noah Reyes had been in the kitchen every spare hour since September, and by December Lydia had stopped pretending this was incidental. She put him to actual work, real technique, not just carrying sacks and minding the coffee. He had instincts she couldn't teach, the particular spatial intelligence of someone who understood heat and time and proportion without being told why they mattered. She taught him the things that could be taught, the knife work, the stock, the way a sauce comes together, and the moment before it goes wrong. I was 20 years old, and he didn't know yet what he was going to do with his life, and she thought teaching him was one of the more useful things she'd done with hers. The Sunday dinners started in January. It had been her idea, and she'd presented it to Silas the way she presented things to him now, directly, with her reasoning laid out, expecting to be taken seriously because he'd established a consistent record of taking her seriously even when he disagreed. She wanted to open the dining hall on Sunday evenings to the wider community. Neighbors, travelers, the families in Decker's Crossing who were isolated, the widows and elderly people and lone hands from smaller operations who didn't have somewhere to be on a Sunday evening and felt the absence of it. Silas had said, "That will cost money." She'd said, "It will also build the kind of goodwill that doesn't show up on a ledger until you need it." He'd said, "How much food are we talking about?" She'd said, "Enough." He'd said, "All right." The first Sunday dinner had 14 people. The second had 23. By March, it was a steady 40, sometimes more, and Lydia had deputized Noah and 2 of the ranch wives from neighboring properties who'd started showing up early to help because they decided they wanted to be part of it rather than just recipients of it. Pete Darrow came to every Sunday dinner and sat in the same chair and ate slowly with his careful formality and always said when Lydia passed, "Thank you, ma'am." Every time. Like the first time, like he was determined that the small dignities didn't become so expected they stopped being noticed. She noticed every time. Burke and Sellers, who by January were eating at the same table with something approaching comfort, showed up to the second Sunday dinner with their families. It turned out both men had families in Decker's Crossing, wives and children they saw on weekends, and the Sunday dinners gave those families somewhere to be that was neither one man's turf nor the other's. The 2 families sat at the same long table on the third Sunday, and the children, who hadn't been told about their father's year of stiff silence, played together without issue in the way children do when the adults have finally stopped making the air difficult. She watched this happen and did not say anything about it to anyone. Some things were better as facts than as observations. The trial, or what passed for one, happened in February. Harlow's land claim was formally dismissed. The forged deed amendment was stricken from the county records. Aldrich Porter surrendered his law license as part of an agreement with the court examiner, which spared him criminal prosecution in exchange for his full cooperation, which included identifying the man who had physically inserted the document, not Crane, as it turned out, but a junior clerk who had worked under Crane and been paid $300 to do it, which was the same amount Silas had given Hector, and coincidence that struck Lydia as darkly apt. Dillard Crane was found living in a small town in the neighboring state, going by a different name, working as a shipping clerk. He was extradited and charged. The man with the red hair who'd had lunch in the Stone Ridge kitchen in 1882 was identified from Hector's description as a property speculator from Houston with existing ties to Harlow's business dealings. He was charged separately. Harlow himself was not charged with a crime, which frustrated Frank considerably, and which Silas accepted with the weariness of a man who'd learned that justice and law occupied overlapping but not identical territories. What happened to Harlow instead was the slower and in some ways more complete consequence of public knowledge. The county board removed him from his appointment. His remaining business partners began finding reasons to renegotiate their agreements. And the people of 3 counties who had deferred to him for years revised that deference without announcement. Howe was not destroyed. He was diminished. And he had to live in that diminishment in the community he'd tried to control, which Lydia thought was probably a more durable consequence than a trial would have produced. She didn't feel satisfaction about it exactly. She felt the particular quiet of a thing being finished, the closing of something that had been open and wrong, the return of a situation to the shape it should always have had. She felt it most clearly on the morning after the verdict, standing at the range at 4:30 in the dark, making the day's first coffee, listening to the ranch sleep around her. The eastern pasture was stone ridges. The fence line was intact. The registration log at the county seat showed a corrected entry. All the pieces were back where they belonged. She put the coffee on and started the biscuits and thought about her mother. Not with grief, particularly, though grief was always there, a resident feeling that had simply become part of the furniture. She thought about her mother the way she thought about her when things were right, with a kind of internal conversation, the kind that happens when someone is gone, but their presence in you is so thorough that you're still in dialogue with them. She thought about what her mother would have made of all this. The 9 miles of road, the 32 men, the sequence numbers, Silas Boone and his almost smiles and his 4 years of managed loneliness, and the way he'd started finishing his meals. She thought her mother would have said, "Well, you always were stubborn about not staying in rooms that were too small for you." She thought her mother would have meant it as a compliment. Silas found her at the range, as he often did now in the early morning, not with any announced intention, just the way 2 people find each other when they've established a shared gravity. He came in quietly and poured his coffee and stood beside her at the range, rather than sitting at the table, which was newer, a smaller distance. "Thinking?" he said. "Always," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February dark was beginning to soften at the edges. The hands wouldn't be up for another hour. The ranch existed in its most honest form in this window, before the day made its demands, before anyone needed anything yet, just the place breathing. "I keep thinking about something you said," he said, "back in September. You said the work is portable, that it goes where you go." "I remember. I've been thinking about what I want this place to be," he said. "Not just a working ranch. That's what it is. I mean, what it's for, what it means." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The Sunday dinners. The way people come here now. It's changed something, and I'm not sure I understood until recently what I wanted that something to be." She looked at him sideways. "And now, I want it to be what it's becoming," he said simply. "A place people can find when they're lost. Not in a grand way, just—" He stopped. "You showed up here with a carpet bag and a cookbook, and that changed everything. I want this to be a place where the next person like that has somewhere to arrive." She felt something settle in her chest, not the restless trying to solve it feeling she'd lived with for most of her adult life, but the rarer thing, the feeling of being in the right place at the right time with the right people, which was rarer than any recipe she'd ever mastered and couldn't be reproduced on command. "It already is," she said. He looked at her. "Is it enough? For you?" She thought about the restaurant she'd lost, the one she'd built in her head every day since, the one in the future that she'd been unable to see clearly because she hadn't known yet what shape it would take. She could see it now. It was here. It was the Sunday dinners and the kitchen that smelled of bread and the long table where 40 people sat on a winter evening and the road from Decker's Crossing that people now walked toward rather than past. "It's more than enough," she said. He nodded once, and they stood at the range together in the early morning dark and waited for the coffee to finish and the day to arrive. In the spring, Lydia sat down with her mother's cookbook. She sat at the work table in the kitchen on an afternoon when the ranch was quiet and the light through the window was the particular light of April in the hill country, warm and slanted and making everything look slightly better than it might otherwise. She opened the book to the last recipe, a simple apple cake that her mother had added in the final year of her life. The handwriting slightly less steady than earlier pages. The measurements precise anyway, because her mother had been precise about the things that mattered. She turned past that page to the blank ones at the back. Her mother had bought a cookbook with extra pages at the back because she'd known from the beginning that she would fill it. Every cookbook her mother had ever owned had ended the same way. The printed recipes of someone else in the front, her mother's own recipes in the back, the margin between them where they talked to each other. Lydia had her mother's handwriting in the front. She'd been leaving the back pages empty for 6 months, not sure what she was waiting for. She took out her pen. She didn't write a recipe. She wrote the first words of what she was already starting to understand would be a different kind of record. The Sunday dinners, the names of people who'd come through the door, the things they'd needed and how a meal had or hadn't met those needs, the adjustments she was learning. Not a recipe book, something more like a map, drawn as she moved through unfamiliar territory. The first entry was dated April 14th. We had 61 people on Sunday. Elena Vasquez came up from Mira Wells with Hector. The boarding house is doing better now. She's taken on 2 other cooks, and she wanted to talk about what we're doing here and how we do it. I told her the only real method is to pay attention. She said she'd already figured that out. I liked her immediately. She wrote for a while. The kitchen made its sounds around her. Through the window, she could hear Noah in the yard doing something with Torres that involved a lot of disagreement in 2 languages. The kind of comfortable disagreement that sounded like irritation, but was actually the opposite. She heard Silas come in from the back pasture, heard him cross the yard, heard the sound of his boots on the porch, and then the kitchen door. He stopped when he saw her at the table with her mother's book. She looked up. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her in that direct, unhurried way he had, the way she'd been learning to receive without deflecting, and she looked back at him, and the kitchen held them both in its warm, ordinary, bread-scented air. "Dinner in an hour," she said. "I'll wash up," he said. He went through to the house. She turned back to the page. She wrote, "The ranch is what it is supposed to be now. Not perfect. The east fence still needs work, and Noah scorched the rice yesterday, and Silas can go 3 days without saying more than 12 words, and sometimes I want to shake him. But it is a place where the door is open, and people find their way here, and sit down and eat together, and go back to their lives a little less alone than they came. That is what a kitchen is for. That is what my mother always knew, and what I'm still learning how to know in my own way. In this kitchen, in this place that I arrived at with $41 and a worn book, and a great deal of anger that turned out, eventually, to be useful." She paused. Then she wrote, "My mother used to say, 'Set one more place. There's always room.' I used to think that was just something she said about tables. I understand now that it was about everything." She closed the book. Outside, the late afternoon was gold and fading, and the sounds of Stone Ridge Ranch were gathering themselves for the end of the day. The hoofbeats and the voices and the particular rhythmic noise of a working place settling into its evening. And inside the kitchen, the range was warm and the bread was rising, and the table was set for whatever number of people would arrive at the door before dark and find themselves, without quite knowing how it had happened, exactly where they needed to be.